Hi, so we've managed to make our way through the first part of Derrida's Of Grammatology, and now we find ourselves beginning part two. Part two is titled Nature, Culture, Writing. The first part was called Writing Before the Letter. So I thought I'd do this video, in this video, attempt to give something of a preview of this part, which is actually the bulk of the book, in an effort to, I don't know, just like I've been doing before, give us some access points into understanding what on earth is at stake for Derrida in the second part of this pretty difficult book. So, um, uh, so in the first part of Grammatology, Derrida, and I'm quoting his very short preface, at the beginning of Grammatology. The very first section was an attempt to outline, again this is Derrida's words, quote, outline a theoretical matrix, to indicate certain significant historical moments, particularly in the history of philosophy, the history of ideas, theology, science, and so on, and to propose certain critical concepts. Okay. In many ways, this explains where the first part is so difficult, that here is where Derrida is attempting to fashion for himself some theoretical and conceptual tools that he's going to use and put to the test in the second part of his book, right? And so this is exactly what he goes on to say. He says, these critical concepts are put to this test in the second part, nature, culture, and writing. Okay? And it's precisely the nature of this test, this nature of testing these critical concepts, that leads Derrida in the opening pages of part two to spend some time talking about how problematic it is, how difficult and problematic it is to choose a specific example with and against which to use those theoretical tools, right? Because whoever you pick, whatever text or whatever author, whatever period you pick, in order to test your theoretical tools, there are some claims going into, and some implicit claims about the exemplarity of the particular figure or the particular authors that you choose. Okay, and so we can talk at length about what Derrida has to say about why he chooses his example. But for now, I thought I'd just give some background about this example and why he chooses this example. Okay, so the figure he focuses on for almost the entirety of this second part. He'll make allusions to other authors, but for the most part, the second part of Grammatology is a reading of the work of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Who is Rousseau? Rousseau is an 18th century Genevan writer, philosopher, and composer. He was born in 1712 and died in 1778. Derrida will in particular focus on a long essay called the Essay on the Origin of Languages. Now what's interesting about that choice is that this was an unpublished work of Rousseau's. And so in the very adoption of it as his primary text, Derrida is being somewhat provocative, because he's focusing on something that most Rousseau scholars might say is marginal, unimportant to the central ideas and the central interventions that the rest of Rousseau's oeuvre undertakes. But Derrida is very careful, because he will read the essay on the origin of languages, and I think we will see this very quickly when we get to chapter 5, that Derrida reads it within the context of a much larger body of work. Okay? And this work includes the discourse on the origins of inequality, a sort of a novel, or, I mean, it's weird because it's both a novel and kind of a treatise on education, this second text called Emile, and also the social contract. These are probably some of his most well-known and significant contributions to philosophy and ethnology and fiction and literature too. Okay, but he's written a lot. Rousseau wrote a ton of stuff and was pretty well known as a public intellectual in the 18th century. Um, what connects Rousseau's interest in primitive societies, his interest in government and politics, his interest on education, his interest in ethics, his interest in moral philosophy and moral psychology, is a single repeated belief that is almost the starting point for all of his work, whether again it's on education or language or primitive societies or what have you. It's the belief that natural man is inherently and innately good, but that social man, or that the cultured man, has been corrupted by the communities he's part of, the culture he's part of, and by society itself. And so, in other words, that Rousseau, his starting point for almost all of his work, is that in the movement from nature to culture, that man moves from an inherent goodness to a corruption, that the process of enculturation is a process of corruption. Okay, and so in his theory of education, for instance, the goal of education, Rousseau thinks, is to counteract that corruption as much as possible, and to kind of redeem the inherent goodness of a person, so that they aren't duped by the social or by the cultural. Okay. So what Derrida hopes to do with Rousseau in testing out his theoretical apparatus. So remember, Derrida has constructed the concept trace, he's constructed the concept difference. That what he hopes to do with Rousseau's work is to show how Rousseau's interest in language in particular, his distrust of writing, that is much like the distrust that other philosophers and theorists have shown throughout history, his distrust of writing, and actually his distrust of language in general, is actually one area in which his whole logocentric work brings about its own deconstruction. That in focusing on Rousseau's theory of language, one can see something announcing itself that actually brings about the displacement of his whole system of thought. Right? And not only that, but that this is useful, Derrida will claim, as an example, that this also can help bring about what he's promised in part one, and that is the deconstruction of the epoch of logocentrism as a whole, right? And again, that epoch includes and encompasses everything from the ancient philosophy of Plato and Aristotle, the theology of St. Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas, the philosophy of Hegel and Martin Heidegger, and also the modern science of linguistics, that of Saussure. Okay. But as you probably will have noticed if you've been reading chapter 4, which is what we'll be discussing on Wednesday, that Derrida doesn't actually talk about Rousseau very much in chapter 4, that he's actually interested instead in a figure or in a writer, let's say, named Claude Lévi-Strauss. Okay. Claude Lévi-Strauss is a French anthropologist and ethnographer, okay, who was actually quite contemporary to us. He was born in 1908 and died in 2009. He lived to be 100 years old. So Claude Lévi-Strauss actually was born before Derrida and outlived Derrida, and only died 4 years ago, right? Which is actually pretty remarkable. Okay. So we might ask, though, why in a section, a very long section, in which Derrida is going to offer us a very detailed reading of the work of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, why begin with Claude Lévi-Strauss? Why begin a detailed reading of an 18th century writer with a major 20th century anthropologist? What's up with that? Okay. We see here a glimpse of Derrida's larger agenda of grammatology, and actually the larger agenda of a lot of his early work. And we actually see it in Of Grammatology. We first encounter it in chapter 2 in the work on Saussure, and that is the deconstruction and the collapse, not of logocentrism, which is 30 millennia old, right? But the collapse and the deconstruction of something called structuralism. Now, what on earth is structuralism? What on earth is it? To put it brutally briefly, when you hear someone talk about structuralism, what they tend to mean is a group of French thinkers who were very active in the 1950s and 1960s, though as Claude Lévi-Strauss demonstrates, they certainly lived well past the 60s. And a lot of these thinkers were inspired by Saussure's linguistics. Okay? They weren't themselves linguists, but they were inspired by his linguistics and his theory of the sign, and sort of extracted, generalized, and moved that theory of signs into other fields. In other words, what they attempted to do was, just like Saussure had purportedly discovered the underlying structure of how meaning emerges and operates in language, that a lot of these French thinkers attempted to find the underlying structure of how other things operated in the world. Okay, so just like then, Saussure does not focus on particular instances of speech, right? He doesn't focus on parole or on parole. He's interested in langue, in the universal system of language itself, not in particular speech utterances, but in a general system of language itself. Okay, just like that, right? Someone like Jacques Lacan, right, will do the same thing in psychoanalysis, right? So he will focus on an attempt to discover the underlying structure of the unconscious, which he claims is structured like a language. Okay, or someone like Roland Barthes, another French intellectual, who would attempt to discover the underlying structure of how literature makes meaning, about how we understand literature, right? The general underlying structures of how we do that. He'll also do it by focusing on instances of popular culture. Roland Barthes will look at like soap advertisements and will find the underlying structure of how advertisements work. Okay, and he will also do it with other things like film and photography. Lévi-Strauss, a contemporary of these French thinkers and French intellectuals, was an anthropologist, right? Meaning he studied cultures, specifically non-Western cultures. And so throughout his work, what he attempted to do was find the underlying structure of how cultures and societies operated, okay? How they worked. And so works that Derrida will cite and reference in this chapter include the elementary structures of kinship. In this book, Lévi-Strauss argues that what really matters in the study of society is the study of the relationships between general and universal roles that people inhabit within that society, right? And not so much the content of the particular societies themselves. So this should sound a little bit like Saussure's work on language. Another work, Claude Lévi-Strauss's Triste Tropique, which is sort of part memoir, part philosophical meditation, part ethnographic analysis of some of his travels in the 1930s. A work like, probably one of his best-known works is The Savage Mind, in which he attempts to discover the underlying structures of thought. Right here, savage does not refer to a particular savage people, but savage as in the most radical foundational structures of human thought. And so this is probably most observable for him in primitive cultures and primitive societies. He's also very well known for a work called Mythologique, in which he does a structuralist analysis of myth. Right? So again, not so much interested in what particular myths of particular cultures mean, right? But trying to find underlying structures that could lead to a comparative analysis of, ancient Greek myths with ancient American myths, mixed with comparative with ancient Asian myths, and I'm talking in very broad ethnocentric categories, but you see again that it's a similar move that he learns from Saussure, to not be interested in a particular mythological utterance, but to try to get underneath it into how it works, so that he can say that in the human consciousness and in all human societies, there are particular underlying mythic structures that all human societies draw on in order to fashion the particular myths of those cultures. Okay. So Derrida's intervention here, really, into Lévi-Strauss's ethnographic work in chapter 4, is to show that a particular Rousseauism, right? Remember Rousseau's idea that in the movement from nature to culture, there's a movement from goodness and purity to a kind of to a corruption, right? What Derrida is going to show is that in Lévi-Strauss's own ethnographic descriptions of language use and certainly of writing in non-Western cultures, particularly in the Nambiquara people, that's indigenous people of Brazil, what he's going to show is that that particular bias still operates, is still working, even in this modern anthropologist's work. Okay, he does show, in order to show that, and then but in analyzing the work of Lévi-Strauss as a preview to his analysis of Rousseau, that from the get-go for him, the entire structuralist project, whether it's Lacan, whether it's Barthes, whether it's Lévi-Strauss, that the entire structuralist project, which purportedly claims for itself a scientific ability to discover and unearth the basic foundational structures of so many things, from human consciousness to human mythologies, to consciousness, to different various media, that all of these attempts are still trapped within, right, the epocally huge trend of logocentrism, phonocentrism, and ethnocentrism. Okay. And so then what has taken itself to be a scientific advance is not actually an advance at all, because it remains within the closure, and remains, for Claude Lévi-Strauss, within the particular closure that Rousseau himself develops in his work on nature and culture and language, too. So in this sense, chapter 4 parallels chapter 2, right? The analysis of Claude Lévi-Strauss in chapter 4, the analysis of Ferdinand de Saussure in chapter 2, and yet remember the difference would be that in chapter 2, Derrida is forging conceptual tools for himself: trace, difference, spacing, writing, exteriorization, deconstruction, whereas here, Derrida is testing those tools out with and against Lévi-Strauss. Okay, so this idea of forging brings to mind one of the most important binaries in Lévi-Strauss's work that Derrida writes a great deal about actually in another place, though he brings it up a little bit at the end of chapter 4 and a little earlier on in chapter 4. One of the ways in which Derrida enters his work and his system is by highlighting one particular binary that comes from Lévi-Strauss's work, The Savage Mind. Right, remember that analysis of the underlying structures of thought. And that binary is between something he calls the bricoleur and the engineer. Okay, so the bricoleur, these two terms sort of correspond to similar roles in society, and yet are split along the binary primitive and modern. Okay, so the engineer, for instance, works with specialized tools, right, and works with those specialized tools for specialized purposes. So think also of like carpenters, right, who have all these ready-made tools that they use for very specific purposes, right? Whereas the bricoleur is a sort of jack of all trades who intuitively uses whatever kinds of tools are at hand, sort of like MacGyver, if you will, right, in order to solve singular problems that announce themselves at specific moments, right? Problems for which the bricoleur is not prepared, right? Why am I going into this? Is because for Lévi-Strauss, there's a kind of vague correspondence between the bricoleur, who is not very specialized, who doesn't have ready-made tools, who solves problems as they emerge and as he encounters them, with primitive societies. And likewise, the engineer is then aligned with modern societies. Okay. So Derrida, if you'll remember, early in chapter 4, page 104 or thereabouts, he talks about how Lévi-Strauss's use of the distinction nature-culture, which is again a binary related to primitive modern, again, related to the binary bricoleur engineer. Derrida will show how Claude Lévi-Strauss knows that the binary nature-culture, which is so important to Rousseau, remember, is something of a ruse, right? It doesn't necessarily explain the fact of really anything. Okay, and yet Claude Lévi-Strauss, Derrida will quote him on page 104, says that nevertheless, for the sake of his methodology, he's going to take that binary and use it anyway, right? Even if it doesn't really describe how things are in the world, he's going to use it anyway as his tool for developing theories and observations about a whole list of things. Okay, and Claude Lévi-Strauss will actually compare this to the work of a bricoleur. What interests Derrida here is that although Lévi-Strauss fancies himself, right, a modern scientist, right, although he is in some sense the father of modern anthropology, nevertheless, although he should be in some sense aligned with the engineer, although the structuralist project should be in some sense aligned with projects of engineers, modern projects, scientific projects, projects using ready-made tools for ready-made purposes. Nevertheless, Derrida is going to claim, and he uses Lévi-Strauss's own words to support this, that Lévi-Strauss is a bricoleur who's pretending to be an engineer. Right? And so this is really what Derrida is talking about on pages 138 to 139 at the end of the chapter. So if you made it that far and you're wondering, what is all this stuff about bricolage and bricoleur and all this sort of stuff, Derrida is really attempting to tease out the consequences of some of the methodological choices Lévi-Strauss makes, and that these have profound consequences for how, concerning the contradictions inherent within Lévi-Strauss's observations concerning primitive capacities in regard to language and specifically in regard to writing. Okay. I'm going to close this by just sort of suggesting that we might think of Derrida himself as something of a bricoleur, right? As someone who inserts himself into systems and just sort of borrows tools and uses them in sort of perverse ways, right? In ways that they weren't intended for. And so, in some sense, while he's talking about Lévi-Strauss as a bricoleur, we might read 138 to 139 a bit, I know this is a bit dangerous, but a bit self-referentially or autobiographically. But Derrida, in some sense, is also talking about himself in these pages. Okay. And maybe I can talk a bit about that a little later, or at least on Wednesday in class. Okay. So anyway, that's my introduction to all this stuff. A little bit of background on who Rousseau is, and a bit about Lévi-Strauss and why he begins with Lévi-Strauss, and a critique of the structuralist project, in order to say that, look, my later analysis of Rousseau really matters, because Rousseau's logic is still structurally inherent in this very modern stuff that structuralism is producing. Okay, and so in that sense, Derrida is not just critiquing the past, not just critiquing Plato, Aristotle, medieval theology, modern philosophy, Rousseau, linguistics. He's also critiquing his present, right? Work that is being done at the very time of grammatology is being written and worked on. Okay, so Derrida is also launching a critique of some of his contemporaries at the same time, and Lévi-Strauss is one of them. Okay. So All right, so this section, in short, I'll just break it down really quick, is still going to be about the deconstruction of writing and speech, or speech and writing, and the deconstruction of presence-absence. But Derrida is now introducing yet another binary here, and that's the binary between nature and culture. Okay, nature and culture, which, as he'll explain early in the section, is a big preoccupation, particularly of 18th century European philosophers and writers like Rousseau. Okay. All right, so that does it for this. I may add another video or two in this fourth lecture series. And I'm not quite sure what they'll be on yet, but regardless, I hope you're doing well, and I'll see you in class or in the next video you watch.